Hilchos Pesulei Hamukdashin Perek Shiva Asar. The laws of disqualified sacrifices, chapter 17. We are still discussing the laws of pigul. The fact that improper thought could affect the sacrifice and disqualify it. And depending on what type of thought you had, if it's an improper name thought, that means you change the name of the person or the type of sacrifice, then in most cases a sacrifice is acceptable. But if it's a chatos or a pesach, the whole thing is disqualified. Then you rise a level to what's called machshavas hamakim. You have an improper place thought that disqualifies all sacrifices. Then you have what's called machshavas hazman. You have an improper time thought. You're thinking to eat or to offer part of the sacrifice in the wrong time. That makes the whole sacrifice pigul. That's the highest level of rejection. Yesterday, the whole chapter was about the fact that in order to become pigul, the only thought that accompanied the sacrifice could be machshavas hazman. If any other thought was mixed in, it brings it down one level to being disqualified. So today the Rambam talks a little bit more about that. Plus, we're going to talk about sacrifices that have either different amounts of procedures or different parts. How one part affects the other. Let's say you have a sacrifice that comes along with bread. If one of them becomes pigul, does the other one become pigul? And multiple examples like that. So the Rambam begins with two types of blood. Some sacrifices have to have their blood applied to the outer altar, the mizbeach hachitzon. Some sacrifices have to have their blood offered on the mizbeach hapnimi, the inner altar. So the Rambam says there's a very big difference, as we learned actually, between blood applied to the outer altar and to the inner altar. Anytime you apply blood to the outer altar, even if the Torah says you have to apply it twice or 4 times, if you just did once, in the end of the day, it's fundamentally okay. But when you're applying blood to the inner altar, Torah usually says 7 times. All 7 times are essential. You can't get away with one. Therefore, says the Rambam, an interesting principle arises as it relates to the laws of pigul, of improper thought. Halacha Aleph, kol hadamim hanitanen al mizbeach hachitzon. Any blood that's supposed to be applied to the outer mizbeach, shenasan mehem matana rishayna b'machshava nechayna. As long as you applied the first application with proper thought, v'nasan mimatana shniya ve'elach, then even if the later applications were applied b'machshavas shinui Hashem, or b'machshavas hamakim, or machshavas hazman, in any of the types of improper thoughts, changing of the name, changing of the place, improper time, harei kiper v'hurtza hakarman. You've already achieved atonement, and the sacrifice was accepted, because the first one is the main one. In the opposite side, v'im nasan esarishayna b'machshavas hazman. If you placed the first application with an improper time thought, even if you concluded the rest of the applications with a different improper thought, an improper place thought, and yesterday we said that if you mix place and time, it brings it down from pigul to just pasul, nevertheless over here, harei zeh pigul. It's still fully rejected. Because the first application is the fundamental one, both for leniency and for stringency. For leniency, that if you had the right intention, that's all we care about in the sacrifice is kosher. For stringency, that if you had the wrong time thought, that's it. It's pigul at this point, no other thoughts could affect it. But when you're talking about blood that's supposed to be applied to the inner altar, since they're all essential one to the other, as we explained, if even one of them, not just the first one, even the second one, or the third one, or the 7th one, if even one of them was applied improperly, and you destroyed the thought, in other words, you had a wrong thought, even though you applied the rest of them properly, hazevach pasul, the sacrifice is disqualified. Because it's like having an improper thought. In the case of the outer altar at the first one, they're all fundamental. So since they're all fundamental, if one of them's thought is destroyed, the whole sacrifice is destroyed. Now by the same token, because they're all essential to one another, in order to reach the highest level of pigul, the highest level of rejection, the improper time thought has to be there all the time. Halacha beis, chasha barishayna machshavas hazman. V'shasak bashar, if the Kohen at the first application on the inner altar is thinking an improper time thought, but the rest of them he's quiet. Quiet meaning he has no specific intent. Or you applied them all properly, but the last one, you had an improper time thought. It's only disqualified, it's not pigul. It's not the fullest form of rejection till you sprinkle all of them, having an improper time thought. Sharei kulan bimatana achasein, or some texts have kimatana achasein. They're all one application essentially. Since Torah says they have to all be done, so they're all considered to be one unit. The Rabbi once said a fascinating lesson on this. Every one of us has two altars. We have two parts of ourselves that we have to offer to Hashem. We have the outer altar and the inner altar. The inner altar means the things that are inner to holiness. Torah, mitzvahs. The outer altar are the parts of our lives that are outside. Business, work, family. Right? In both cases, there has to be blood offered on the altar. What's blood? Blood is warmth. Blood is animation. Blood is energy. Both the energy that we put into our outside lives and the energy that we put into the inside lives have to be dedicated to Hashem. Of course, business, family, and work should be with a higher purpose. But even when you learn and do mitzvahs, you can lose track of God. You have to have Hashem in mind when you're doing Torah and doing mitzvahs. And there's a fundamental difference. In the outer altar, as long as you apply the first blood properly, it's good. In other words, as long as your general approach to business, family, and work is to find Hashem in it, that's fine, even if the specifics don't exactly play out. But when you're in the realm of inside, of holy things, it's all the more important to be in touch with Hashem. Even if you lose track of Hashem in even one part, it could already disqualify the whole thing. So that's the mystical takeaway from this halacha. Halacha Gimel. Tvilas etzba bedam hachatois hapnimiyos mifageles. The part of the service where the Kohen dips his finger inside the blood of the sin offerings that are offered inside is essential. It could create pigul. What does this mean? The certain sin offerings had to have their blood offered, sprinkled on the pareiches, on the curtain between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKodashim, and also on the inner altar. And the Torah says every time the Kohen sprinkled, he had to dip his finger in the blood. You can't just dip it once and sprinkle 3 times. Each sprinkle requires a dip. So the Rambam says that makes the dipping essential. And so if you have a wrong thought while you're dipping, it creates pigul. Ketzah, what does that mean? Chashav b'shas tvilas etzba b'dam. Machshavas hazman, if while the Kohen is dipping his finger in the blood, he has an improper time thought, harezekim mechashev b'shas hazoya. That's like having an improper thought during sprinkling, which literally disqualifies the entire sacrifice. Halacha dalid, another principle related to thought. Hoya oimid ba'azaram. If the Kohen is standing outside in the temple courtyard, v'chashav machshavas hazman b'chatois hanasos bifnim b'dovar hanasa bifnim. And he's thinking an improper time thought about a sin offering that's offered inside, but he's thinking about a part of the service that's going to be done inside. So follow the details. He's standing outside, thinking about an inside sacrifice, inside service. Einay pigul. That's not pigul. Cannot make it rejected. Chashav b'davar hanasa b'chutz harei pigul. But if while standing outside, he's thinking about an outside service, that works. And it transforms the sacrifice into fully rejected pigul. Halacha hey ketzad, what does this mean practically? Hoya oimid ba'azara. Kohen is standing in the temple courtyard. V'amar, and he says, Hareini shoichet lahazois domei lemacher. I'm slaughtering this sin offering that's supposed to be offered inside. I'm planning to sprinkle its blood inside tomorrow. Einay pigul. That's not pigul shahazoya lifnim b'heichal, because in the case of this sacrifice, where's the sprinkling done? Inside. So you're standing outside thinking about an inside service. On the other hand, hoya oimid b'heichal. If you were inside the heichal, v'amar, and you said, Harei ani mazeh lishpech shirayim lemacher. I'm sprinkling the blood here, but I'm having in mind to pour out the remainder of the blood, which is an outside service, tomorrow. Also einay pigul. It's not pigul. Shaharei chashav bifnim b'davar hanasa b'chutz. You're inside thinking about an outside service. Avolim hoya oimid ba'azara v'shachat. But if you're outside in the temple courtyard and you're slaughtering, and you're thinking to do an outside service tomorrow, I'm going to pour the remaining blood outside tomorrow, or I'm going to offer the parts of the mizbeach tomorrow. That is pigul, because you're outside and you're thinking about an outside service. Halacha Zayin, moving now to how 2 parts of a sacrifice interact. So we begin with the toida. The toida is the Thanksgiving offering. Usually it was a sheep, and it was brought together with 40 different loaves of bread. Says the Rambam, "Hatoida mifageles halechem, v'halechem inim mifageles hatoida." Improper thoughts related to the actual sheep or the actual animal will stretch the pigul both to the animal and also to the bread. But if the bread becomes problematic, it doesn't make the offering problematic. Ketzad, what's an example of this? Hashoichet hatoida. A Kohen slaughters the actual animal of the toida offering. And he's thinking he wants to eat the meat, sprinkle the blood, offer the parts tomorrow. That's an improper time thought. That makes the offering pigul. Not only the offering, says the Rambam, hazevach im halechem pigul. Both the animal and the bread are fully rejected. But if while slaughtering the sacrifice, he's thinking only about the bread, he wants to eat the bread tomorrow, only the bread is pigul, but not the offering, because the bread cannot affect the offering. Same thing applies. On Shavuos, there was 2 communal lambs. Here's the 2 sheep, together with the 2 loaves of bread that were brought with them. So same thing. If the Kohen has an improper time thought about the sheep, that also makes the bread pigul. If all you're thinking about is eating the 2 breads tomorrow, then the breads are problematic, but not the offerings, not the sheep. Choshav, says the Rambam, what if the Kohen thought during one of the integral services of the sacrifice of the lambs, lechol kazayis mibsar hazevach im halechem lemachar. He wants to eat a kazayis, a combined olive-sized portion from the meat of the lambs and the bread. So he's thinking about both. So it's an improper time thought related to both together. Halechem levadoy pigul vehatoida oy hakvasim inan pigul. Interestingly, over here, only the bread is pigul and not the sheep or the offering in the case of the toida. Why? Because in this case, you don't have a full kazayas from the offering itself. And therefore, we're going to only make the bread problematic, but not the offering itself. Halacha tes, we remember that the lechem apanim, the showbread, had 2 parts. There was the actual breads, and then the 2 spoons of frankincense that were offered as well on the mizbeach. So the Rambam says, Hamukdashin neim beziche levaina. She'im lechem apanim, the Kohen is offering the 2 spoons of frankincense that come along with the showbread. The chashav bishas haktarasan, and while he's offering them, what's he thinking? She'yoichal lechem hapanim lemachar, that he's going to eat the showbread tomorrow. Hari halechem pigul. So here, it doesn't look that way, but you would think the bread is more important than the spoons. No, the spoons could affect the bread, because the spoons are the main offering. So if you have an improper thought while offering the spoons about the bread is pigul. Halacha yud hasheichet shnei kivsei atzeres. Back to the Shavuos case, notice there's 2 lambs and 2 breads. So if while the Kohen is slaughtering both lambs of Shavuos, he only thinks to eat one of the 2 breads tomorrow, shteihen pigul. Too bad. They're one entity. A problematic thought about one bread disqualifies both. Same thing with the lechem apanim. Yud Aleph, hiktir shnei abezichim, v'hu mechashev lechol echad mishnei asdarim lemachar. The Kohen is offering both spoons of frankincense, but he's thinking, I only want to eat from 1 row of breads tomorrow. Shnei asdarim pigul. Both rows are totally pigul. V'cheinim chashav machsheves hazman be'achas mechales hatoida or be'achas mechales minchas mafei hatanor. You're thinking an improper time thought while offering one of the breads of the toida, where there's many, many more, or one of the breads of the type of mincha which was baked in an oven. Hare kol achales pigul. Improper thought related to one challah makes all the challahs pigul. Aval halacha yud gimel im nitmes achas mishtei achalais oy echad mishnei asdarim oy achas mechales hatoidam. But if it's not an improper thought, it's an improper action. One of the 2 breads of Shavuos became impure. One of the 2 rows of lechem apanim became impure. One of the toida breads became impure. Bein lifnei zrika, bein la'achar zrika. Whether before or after the sprinkling of the blood of the actual sacrifice. Oysa hachala v'oysa haseder asur v'hatar b'taharasa yeyachel. It's actually distinct. The one that became impure is impure and forbidden to be eaten, and the one that remains pure should be eaten in purity. Halacha yudalid. Chashav ba'avodas echad mishnei hakvasim sheyoichal kezayis mishtei halechem lemachar. The Kohen is only occupied with one of the lambs, not both as in the other case. He's working on one of the lambs of Shavuos, and he's thinking he's going to eat a kazayis from the 2 breads tomorrow. V'cheinim chashav b'haktaras echad mishnei habezichin sheyoichal kezayis milechem aponim lemachar. Unlike before where he was offering both spoons, here he's only offering 1 spoon, and he's thinking to eat a kazayis of the lechem aponim tomorrow. Hari alechem pasul ve'enei pigul. In this case, it does disqualify the bread, but only at the lower level of pasul, but not fully pigul. Ad sheyachshev b'chol hamatir shehu avodas shnei akvasim v'haktaras shnei habezichin. As we saw yesterday, in order for something to become pigul, the entirety of the service which permits the rest of it to be eaten has to have an improper thought. Here, what permits the breads to be eaten? Both lambs, both spoons. If you only have an improper thought by one lamb or one spoon, it cannot affect the rest of the sacrifice to become pigul. Halacha tesvav, what if between the two you have a full thought? Shachat echad, Kohen slaughters one lamb. V'chashav lechol chatzi zayis mechala zu lemachar. While he slaughters one lamb, he thinks he wants to eat half an olive-sized portion tomorrow from this bread. V'shachat hasheni, then he slaughters the second loaf. V'chashav lechol chatzi zayis mechala shniya lemachar. And I was thinking about a half an olive-sized portion about the other bread. So between the two lambs, he's thought about a full kazayis in proper time thought. Hare elu mitzdarfin lepigul. They do combine. And now there's pigul. Same law applies. If while one spoon he thinks about one row, the other spoon thinks about another row, they combine. Halacha tezayin choshav be'echad mishnei akvasim machshavas hazman ve'asa hasheni b'machshava nechayna. Forget how the lambs affect the bread. Now the lambs themselves. You have two lambs on Shavuos. The Kohen, during one of them, he's thinking an improper time thought, but the second one is totally proper. The two lambs don't interrelate. The one that you had improper time thought is disqualified, other one is kosher. Yud Zayin, shachat echad mehen. If while slaughtering one of the lambs, while working with one lamb, you're thinking about the other lamb, I'm slaughtering this one to eat the other one tomorrow, they're actually both kosher. You cannot have improper thoughts from one to the other. So, since you didn't have an improper thought about this one, while offering this one, you're thinking about the other one, so none of them affect each other. Yudches, shnei kivsei atzeres, ein mekachin es halechem ela b'shchita. The two lambs that accompany the two breads, they only cause the bread to become holy when they're slaughtered. Ketzad, what does that mean? Shchatam v'zaragdamam b'machsheves shinui Hashem. If you were to slaughter these lambs, or sprinkle their blood, and have the wrong sacrifice or not have the community in mind, lo kidesh alechem, the bread will not become holy. On the other hand, shchatan lishman, once you slaughter the lambs with the right purpose, v'zarak damam shalei lishman, if you sprinkled the blood not for the right purpose, halechem kadosh ve'enoi kadosh, the bread is kind of in the middle, holy but not holy. Shchatan shalei lishman, afal pisha zarak lishman, but if you slaughter them with the wrong intention, even if you sprinkle them with the right intention, loy kidesh alechem, again the bread is not sanctified, because during the slaughtering, it didn't have the proper thought. Yutes shtei halechem sheyatzu ben shchita lizrika. The two breads left the temple premises between the slaughtering and the sprinkling of the blood of the lambs. V'zarak dam hakvasim b'machshavas hazman. And then while the bread is outside, you sprinkle the blood of the lambs with the wrong time thought. Nispaglu shtei halechem afal pi shehin b'chutz. That affects the bread. Even though they're outside, they become pigul. Because the sprinkling could have an effective power over an entity which has left the temple premises, even though it's still outside. Halacha chav, an interesting halacha. Kivsei atzeres sheshchatan lishman. You have the two lambs slaughtered for the right purpose, ve'avad halechem, and then the bread got lost. Im zarak daman lishman. If you then still go ahead and sprinkle the blood of the sheep with the proper intent, hare elu psulin. The sheep have become disqualified. Because at the point where you slaughtered them for the right purpose, they sanctified the bread. Now they're related to the bread. Now that you lost the bread and you sprinkled the blood properly, the lost bread affects the sacrifice and the whole thing becomes disqualified. Zorak daman b'machsheves hazman. That's how most texts have it. Achar she'avad halechem, if you sprinkled the blood with an improper time thought after the bread was lost, but I'm going to switch it like the Kesef Mishnah does, and I'm going to say zarak daman b'machsheves shinui Hashem. Achar she'avad halechem. You sprinkled the blood and you changed the name in your mind after the bread was lost. Hare elu safek im hutru ba'achilo eloi hutru. There's a doubt whether this makes them permissible or not. How do we explain this? I'll give you one presentation from the Griz, the famous Chidushi HaGriz. He says the case over here is, Machsheves Shinui Hashem means that you changed the name from being the lambs for Shavuos to being a regular shlomim, a regular peace offering, which doesn't require bread. So now, even though the bread is lost, since you've now changed the name to a regular shlamim, maybe this causes the status of the lambs to become like a shlamim and they don't require bread. So funny enough, having an improper thought makes it more kosher. That's why the Gemara considers that possibility. The Gemara also considers the other possibility that you can't have a thought which would ruin a sacrifice usually, and here's going to make it good. But there's a doubt. There's a doubt if that makes it permissible or not, and therefore we leave it in doubt. By the way, just for bonus points, there's a Merkeves HaMishnah who justifies the classic text, Machsheves Hazman, by applying the same interpretation. He says, if you change the thought from the Shavuos lamb to a regular shlamim, really, if you just thought the word shlamim in your head, it's not considered a change, because essentially they are a shlamim. You would have to think, I'm having in mind a shalmei yachid, an individual shlamim. Now, once you have in mind an individual shlamim, you're also changing the time, because an individual shlamim could be eaten for an extra day. Shalmei tzibur can only be eaten for that day and a night. By having in mind shalmei yachid, what are you really doing? You're extending the time frame. So it's the exact same thing as a time thought. You're thinking, I want to eat this sacrifice for an extra day. So in this case, Machsheves Hazman and Machsheves Shinei Hashem are the same thing. But the point is, there's a doubt whether the thought helps to make it kosher or not, and we leave it in the doubt.